sponsored by the James Madison Council and the National Endowment for the Arts.
Welcome to the National Book Festival, and we've got a great panel for you here today. My name is Bethanne Patrick. I am a book critic, and I also love to interview authors. And today I have two wonderful women here with me. First, Silvia Garcia Moreno, whose Mexican Gothic came out last year and whose Velvet Was the Night will come out this summer, both from Del Rey, and Sarah Pearse, whose debut novel, The Sanatorium, came out this year, is from Pamela Dorman Books. And I want to say welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I have lots of questions, and I will try very hard not to run over our time. And I know we also want to make sure that these questions are really clear and we are able to reach as many audience members as possible. So the first thing I want to address to both of you is about genre itself. And we're going to talk about a couple of different genres, but working in a genre, I think, can be really exciting and really freeing. And so I wanted to ask you each what genre means to you. And it could be a sentence, it could be a little bit longer, whatever you like. Silvia, may I start with you?
Hello. I don't work in one specific category. I like to move between categories and between genres. Well, genre constitutes the basic tropes that surround a certain narrative, along with its history and the texts that have come before and that are in conversation with each other.
Yes, excellent. And that is so true about the text being in conversation. I think that's going to be very important for some things we talk about later. Thank you. How about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I think very much to echo what Silvia says. And I think also it kind of provides a touch point. I think one of the key things I was thinking about when I was writing the book is around how a reader sees something. And I think a genre is often very much a very easy touch point for the reader. And I know when I'm in a certain kind of mood and want to read a certain kind of book, I think genre is something that almost bypasses people's expectations of a book. I think they can read a blurb, they can look at things, but I think when you see a book categorized in a certain kind of way, that immediately brings to mind for the reader certain echoes, as you say, in a textual kind of context, and provides that shortcut for them. So I think for me, genre encompasses sort of everything Silvia said. And yeah, it's very much about the reader, I would say.
It's a really interesting thing. I'm glad you brought up the reader because I know that there are readers who can't get enough of Gothic novels. And we are going to talk about noir a little later when we speak about Silvia's upcoming book. But I know I'm one of the readers who can't get enough of the Gothic tropes and the Gothic conventions. No matter what else I read, no matter what other genres I look at, I really enjoy it. And so what does Gothic bring up and what does it allow you to do? Silvia?
Mm-hmm. Gothic is a bit of a proto-genre. It is the forefather to some modern categories that we know. On the one hand, horror. On the one hand, I would say it's a forerunner to domestic noir and also to some types of romance. There are really two types of Gothic, what is termed the female Gothic, which are romantic stories in which there are no supernatural elements. So that's the Scooby-Doo kind of situation where it turns out that it's not a ghost, it's a mad wife in the attic,
right?
That sort of situation. And then you've got what is normally termed the male Gothic, and those tend to be stories that have supernatural elements, have a lot more explicit violence and sex. So the parent of that would be something like The Monk, and then you would have works like Dracula, that sort of situation. Because Gothic is develops from the Romantic movement, which begins in the 1700s and is all about heightened emotion. Both of these categories share certain commonalities. Things in Gothic are very big, and so if you think about Wuthering Heights, people are yelling across the moors.
Yes,
it's big and dramatic, but because it's this very large category and it encompasses this twin poles, you sometimes get things that feel quite different in a way. So a narrative such as Frankenstein, which is another type of Gothic, feels very different from the romanticism of Jane Eyre, of Wuthering Heights. But there's still, it's kind of like this, it's forming this category, and it will later split into other variants, and that's how you will get on bookshelves something that we now recognize as a certain type of romance. We don't call that Gothic, but that has many of the elements that might have been employed in a Gothic in the 1800s, such as the Byronic hero. He's bad, mad, and dangerous to know. The exotic location, the ingenue that are deployed in romances that are kind of bubbling up in the 70s as romance comes to be a certain category.
There's so many things that what you said just brought up for me, Silvia. But Sarah, I want to let you talk a bit about the Gothic genre, if, as Silvia said, a proto-genre, and about where the Sanatorium fits in to these strands that overlap. And I want to make sure to mention, just because we may move along, is that Mexican Gothic, Silvia's novel, is a Gothic that also has horror in it. So it would be more of that, I guess, male Gothic, if you will, although it's not. I don't think so. But the Sanatorium has elements of horror as well, but they're less supernatural and more psychological. Not to say there's no psychological horror in Mexican Gothic, just that in the Sanatorium, that really comes to the fore for your characters. So, Sarah, again, what does Gothic mean to you? What did it mean to you as you went in to write the book?
Yeah, I think I probably came at it from quite an unusual angle. I did an interview recently where we were talking about kind of the horror elements of the book. And I think for me, I very much see it kind of crossing genre. There's definite elements of what you kind of constitute as an ordinary murder mystery. But I think really identifiable bits of the Gothic genre within the book are very much that kind of sense of, I suppose I come at it from that sense of melodrama. I think for me, you have everything is almost, to use a modern term, maxed out. So you have a very dramatic building. For me, the kind of Sanatorium as a building very much kind of fits with the tropes. And I think actually a book I was very much influenced by is A Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. I don't know if you've read that book. Yeah, where the house becomes very much a character in itself. And I think you have within Gothic novels, you often have that kind of very much a very strong sense of place. And I think for me, the Sanatorium, the building, Le Sommet, as it becomes within the novel, very much kind of uses that sense of place to create the sense of unease. And I think you have within the main character of Ellen, that kind of psychological, as you mentioned, that kind of almost chipping it away at her sort of sense of self, as she sort of sees lots of things that happen within the Sanatorium, but also the external environment. And I think that kind of weather is very much, again, a sort of trope you see within the Gothic novel. And I think for me, it very much reflects Ellen's internal kind of character and how she's feeling. I think we see the heightening weather in the Sanatorium is very much something I wanted to sort of build for the reader and for Ellen alike, that kind of sense of heightened tension. So for me, I think you have kind of lots of element of the Gothic within there, but yeah, also the elements of horror. I think a lot of people as well, touching on the supernatural, saw the book at the beginning going that way. It wasn't something I ever had in my mind, but I think through using those other elements, you kind of have that sense, that creeping sense of unease that something else is going to happen that might not perhaps be connected to the real world. So I think I drew on lots, but it wasn't necessarily a conscious thing while I was doing it.
It's not necessarily conscious, because I would never presume to think that writers have all the answers about their own work, because the work, takes on things that the rest of us interpret, the reader responds. However, I do want to bring up, I want Silvia to respond in a way, because the atmosphere of the books, both books, is extremely important. And I wanted you, Silvia, to tell us a little bit about the layers of atmosphere you built up, because we go from a modern Mexico City in the 1950s, very cosmopolitan and sophisticated, to this almost, well, it is a colonial British kind of home, which is set in the middle of a Mexican silver mining town. And then that home has layers beneath. And so the atmosphere builds up through those different, it's a journey. Mexican Gothic is a real journey in the atmosphere. So would you talk about that for a moment, please?
Yes, I think that sometimes people who are not very familiar with subgenres or categories tend to have a very broad understanding of books, and that means that they don't kind of get some of the nuances and differences between one and the other.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in terms of Gothic horror, what I call the male Gothic, it is definitely a category that relies on ambience and on subtleties rather than being the equivalent of a slasher film.
Mm-hmm.
So Edgar Allan Poe, when you read him, has elements of decay, of death, of disease, and sometimes even of the supernatural that are woven into the narrative, and that create this ambiance that helps you sink into the story. But it's not necessarily incredibly gory and violent in a very explicit sort of way. And so that is one of the keys of Gothic, is atmosphere and the creation of this sense of malaise that overlays over the story. You see it in Turn of the Screw, you see it in other works, and there's a certain slowness to it that naturally seems to be embedded in these narratives. And I think one of the problems with that is that audiences that are not accustomed to that say that it's very boring or slow or dull. So I remember there's somebody that I know that they hadn't read, I think it was Turn of the Screw. They had never read it before, and it's widely recommended as a Gothic novel or a classic literature, also a ghost story. And I told them, well, just be warned that Turn of the Screw is a classic kind of Gothic narrative, but they didn't understand what that meant. And then later they came on and told me nothing happens. This is so They said nothing happens. And it's because it is a lot about atmosphere and psychology and the interior being reflected by the exterior, right? So those windswept moors and those stormy nights, the wind banging on the shutters, are reflections of the interior psychology of characters. And so you've got a lot of work that is being done interiorly, not so much people hacking heads off and fighting the living dead sort of situation. And so, yeah, it's definitely about atmosphere and layers. I think for modern audiences, that can be difficult to grasp and to toy with because it can seem very old-fashioned. It's not exactly something that we're used to reading and consuming in certain ways. Also, especially a lot of Gothic narratives use framing devices that are unusual for nowadays. People writing a letter or sitting in a salon and saying, let me tell you the story of this person who went mad. That those sorts of framing devices sometimes throw people off. And also this building of atmosphere, which is characteristic of the Gothic, can also throw people off because it can seem too much for a modern audience. Like it's just way too much information about the architecture of a certain place or the weather. And I think people might be like, what's next? What's next? What's next? So
that is so interesting. It never occurred to me, just because I am such a devoted reader of the Gothic and have read so many different kinds, like, as you said, the different layers and strands in the genre itself, not just in these novels. So, Sarah, how do you feel about that? Have you seen readers wondering, why isn't something happening? Why do we have to wait so long? Have you heard things like that?
Actually, as Silvia mentioned, there has been a lot of feedback actually initially about like the kind of beginning, probably quarter of the novel. I think I do quite a lot in terms of sort of setting, not just the sort of wider environment, but the hotel itself. And I focused a little bit on the architecture. You have the building is obviously an abandoned sanatorium. It's been converted, but you have lots of elements of the sort of clinical aspect of the sanatorium described, as well as lots of sort of modernist aspects of the architecture. Which was used particularly in the Alps. The buildings themselves were used essentially as a clinical instrument. So they had huge windows, balconies to bring in lots of light. And yeah, the building itself, as I say, became a clinical instrument. And then within the novel, I've used it kind of as a device. But I think there has been a lot of frustration. It takes a while to get into the novel. I also draw a lot on kind of Ellen's feelings, and you have a sense of her anxiety as it's building. You're then describing, as I say, the architecture, the surrounding environment. And a lot of people have kind of said, well, I wanted to get to when something happened. So we do have the kind of discovery of a body, but I think there was a sense of some readers saying, why didn't that happen sooner? But I think on the other side of the coin, a lot of readers have said they enjoyed that slow build up and that kind of tick, tick, tick of the atmosphere slowly building. So yeah, I think what Silvia says is right. I think it very much depends on the reader expectations and what they are wanting from that. Because yeah, I don't have something dramatic happening immediately, but I did that in order to build that atmosphere.
What you both just said brings me so many questions, ladies. But one that I want to get to is about the ladies, and because you mentioned Ellen, Sarah, Noemi in Mexican Gothic, Ellen in the Sanatorium, and also we will talk about and Silvia, I hope I'm saying this correctly, but please help me get it right. Maite in Velvet Was the Night.
That's right.
Excellent. All of these are women who they're not damsels in distress. The distress comes from other places. I see them as strong women with a lot of not complete self-knowledge, but some self-knowledge. And of course, in much earlier Gothic novels, mystery novels, horror novels, you would often find a woman who was completely helpless, completely incapable. And so one of the things about these novels that I enjoyed was seeing women who aren't necessarily, they don't have all the answers. They don't have all of the things they need, but they are pretty savvy and they are willing to be active on their own behalf and on the behalf of others. Would both of you, either one of you can respond first?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You use the word Ellen as a strong character. And I think that's something, it's interesting kind of hearing different feedback from readers. That's something that has quite polarized people. And I'm actually quite glad about that. I think for her, a lot of people have said they don't see her as a strong character because she is quite kind of open about her emotions, and she's able to kind of talk through that kind of sort of, I don't necessarily think she even talks through it necessarily. I think you have some of that kind of in a monologue, but you very much have her behavior. She's acting in what would be described as kind of an emotional way, but I don't even necessarily like that kind of description. I think she as a person is just very much her. And I think as a detective, I kind of wanted her to be quite different from the traditional detective you usually see. And I think people have struggled with that a little bit. I think people want to kind of see almost a masculine detective, kind of masculine traits, which I wouldn't necessarily describe as masculine. But that's kind of how people describe that kind of very much a physical strength, the buttoned up emotion. So yeah, I think Ellen is a strong woman because she is kind of unafraid to be herself. And I think she kind of lays it all out there for the reader, and in a way for herself. She's kind of going on a journey and exploring who she is through what happens. But yeah, that's kind of been polarizing. I think a lot of people see that kind of behavior, and as something I want to look at is in the workplace as well, as weak. If someone is openly emotional, that's seen as a weakness. But yeah, that for me is a strength, and that's something I wanted to play on.
Yeah, Gothic heroines are interesting because they, just like the Gothic genre, they tend to be different things at the same time and sometimes contradict each other. So if you look at kind of the traditional Gothic in the very beginning and some of the stuff in the 1700s and 1800s, characters like Emily from The Mysteries of Udolpho, she faints 10 times in the narrative of the novel, and is completely a victim. On the other hand, Victor Frankenstein also faints swoons 3 times during that novel. So, but mostly it's women, and they are fainting and they're being kind of helpless. You kind of get an evolution of that as the years and the decades go by. And so by the time you get to the 1960s, when you have the Gothic revival, which is when you've got this Victoria Holt and all these mass market paperbacks that you find at drugstores and that people my age are most familiar with because our mothers bought those, with a woman running away on the cover, a very specific aesthetic. Those heroines are really, they're both victim and an active player, and often victim and detective at the same time. They're doing the Scooby-Doo romantic Gothic kind of thing where they have to find out what's really happening, and it's going to be that there's the man, old Farmer Willis in the yard pretending to be the ghost at midnight, that sort of situation. And so these women are constantly being victimized through the narrative, but they're also active agents in a way because they are playing sleuth. They are trying to solve a mystery, a puzzle of that sort. It is sometimes difficult for people, I think, to understand that women, especially women, well, characters in general, but women specifically, can be multifacetic, and that one person is not just one single thing. And the demands are often that men can be multifacetic in some ways. And so that's why you have the Byronic hero, who is both kind of, he has elements that are evil and coercive at the same time, but he's also a romantic hero and is redeemable and all that kind of stuff. If you had a woman playing the romantic Byronic hero, everybody would, say that she is a big bitch and would hate her. And you don't have to be that for people to hate a heroine. You just have to have somebody who, like was mentioned, has emotional problems or is, emotionally open, and that's considered weakness, and she's considered to be stupid or dumb. And so there's certain things that we can allow of other kinds of characters, but not of women characters. We seem very disinclined to give them certain nuances and leeway, and especially I think the psychological frailty that can sometimes be found in Gothic, because it is about women sometimes being gaslighted, about finding themselves in these positions of victim but active player at the same time, can cause people to have very negative emotions towards them, because we really want women to be kind of, when they are in a certain active role, when they're the main protagonist and they're in this kind of narrative where they're facing off against somebody or something, we want them to take an Ellen Ripley approach to get the flamethrower and burn the alien down immediately and be like, I'm a bad, tough lady. And if a woman stops for a second and says, oh my God, I don't know if I'm going mad or what is happening here, I don't understand how the pieces of the puzzle fit, we just say, oh, what a weakling, and what a silly lady that is, or even worse, But I think that has to do a lot with how we envision women, the dimensions that we allow women to inhabit, and how uncomfortable we are with what I would call complicated women.
Yeah, sorry, just to...
Oh,
sorry,
no, please. That is so well said. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that was, it's such a good point about kind of almost a double standard, how men are held up within fiction. And I think it's something really interesting as a reader. I don't think it's something people are necessarily aware of. But yeah, when I've been reading feedback, not just about my book, but about other books, as Silvia says, there's a lot of leeway given to a male character that isn't to a woman. I think, as I said, really believe that the female characters, in order to be strong, and the leading character, they are meant to be seen in a very, what I would describe as the traditionally masculine way. So they are kind of there with their sword, they're behaving in a masculine way, which yeah, definitely Ellen doesn't in the Sanatorium. And I think that definitely causes people problems. I think they're very uncomfortable. You can echo it in any kind of workplace I've worked in. I've seen a very similar thing where people are uncomfortable with kind of emotions being shown, and you are meant to conform to a standard, which I don't think anybody has set. There's just that inbuilt within society of how we are seen to be meant to behave in that kind of workplace environment. And I think if someone breaks away from that, it kind of makes people question themselves a little bit as well. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
I love hearing you both talk about this because it's so true. And sometimes, it used to be that women were the Madonna or the whore. And now I almost see it more as women get to be Sansa Stark or Arya Stark. And you get to be the very noble, ruler who sits on the throne and is queen in the north, or you get to be the action hero with your sword named Needle. And it's very difficult for us to accept a woman who could do all of those things. But it's also very difficult for us to accept that a woman might not want to do all of those things. And so with that, I want to take a quick turn to Velvet Was the Night, Silvia's upcoming novel, because this is a noir. And Silvia, I don't mean to embarrass you, but having just read it, it is pitch perfect and superb. I mean, truly, this is an amazing, amazing book. I want to encourage everyone, after you read Mexican Gothic and the Sanatorium, to pick up Velvet Was the Night. It's set in Mexico City, if I'm correct about that, at least parts of it, in the 1970s. And the reason I want to bring this up now is not just to talk about women in other genres, including mysteries, Sarah. We're not leaving you out. But I also want to bring up the fact that Maite, the protagonist who's a woman, sort of joins forces with El Elvis, who is involved in a government-sponsored / sanctioned movement, and this is historically accurate, that is supposed to put down student uprisings. And I'm not going to spoil anything else for readers, but Maite has such different expectations on her as a woman in the 1970s in Mexico. And you work with that. She is wholly of her time and place, but she also is very individual and very, I think she's pretty feisty for who she is and where she's come from. Would you agree with that, Silvia?
I think, I don't know if she's feisty, but I do think Maite is chafing against certain expectations. So in 1971 in Mexico, I mean, a lot of things are happening. One of the things that is happening is obviously that the Mexican government is imprisoning, torturing, and killing student activists that they see in any way as communist or left-leaning.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that is happening is that the role of women is changing. And this is happening in other parts of the world. Obviously, it's in the United States and in Canada, the UK, and all parts of the world. There are several parts of Latin America. There are questions about what are the limits and the roles of womanhood and sexual mores, reproductive rights, all that kind of thing. But we're still in 1971 in Mexico City amongst a certain social class. And for example, you're an old maid if you haven't married and you're 30, like
right.
Maite. People don't take you seriously if you don't have a husband. And there's certain things where in that time period, you really needed to have a husband. So one of the things that I mentioned, I think, is that she has problems with the mechanic because they're price gouging her. And if it was a guy, it wouldn't be like that. This is something that I remember, my mother saying that was true, that when you were unmarried, there were certain kind of monetary transactions where there would be a premium that you would have to pay for inhabiting that role of the old maid. And not everybody could inhabit that role of the old maid. That also comes with a lot of social privilege and money that can be an old maid and that you don't have to marry. So there's all these ideas about what it's like, what it is like to be living in 1971 in Mexico City. It wasn't so long ago, but that's when my mother was young. And the things that she tells me about being a woman back then is kind of terrifying in many ways. But the other thing is that Maite is a reader of romance novels, and she's a fan of that. And she's a fan of those narratives, romance comic books, which were popular at the time in Mexico, but in other parts in the United States too, in English. And it's really a clash of genres. It's a clash between noir which has a certain aesthetic, and romance, and the destruction of romance in many ways or forms. How that is not what is going on here. It's somebody who would like to maybe be in a Victoria Holt novel, in the castle with the Moor and the ironic hero, and have the happy ending, but instead ends up in this seedy little, dirty noir. And it's not even like the Hollywood noir of the Gildas and the
right
sexy noir. It's the 1970s sort of Chinatown grungy sort of situation.
Pretty, yeah.
So it is like, it's a play on genre and genre expectations in a way, but there's also some thought put into expectations of what it's like to be a woman at that time.
Thank you. I just loved it. And there's so much to talk about with it, but maybe I'll get a chance to speak with you about it after it comes out too. And that leads me, Sarah, to asking you about what comes next, because the Sanatorium is your debut. And I know either or both of you may or may not want to talk about what you're working on, but I also know that since we are talking in a panel that so many readers are going to enjoy, if you can give us a few hints, that would be great.
Yeah, my next book will be called The Retreat, and it is out probably sort of March or April time next year. And I'm continuing with Ellen. I think when I first started thinking about her as a character, I kind of knew there was more. I think with her and the partner we meet in the book called Will, I'm sure readers will be familiar with the relationship, and there was some interesting feedback on the dynamics between the two of them, which we'll see develop more in the next book. But yeah, it's very much continuing in the kind of murder mystery genre, but we also have elements again of horror. I think I'm very much attracted to that sense of place. So it's actually set locally, so where I am in South Devon, and we have a real sense of Ellen's home environment, what has kind of influenced her as a person, and yeah, hopefully another very sort of fun book.
That sounds really fun. I do want to know what kind of retreat it is.
Yeah, it's very isolated. I can't say too much. I'm not sure exactly how much I'm going to say, but yeah, we follow from Ellen's point of view, but we also follow from a group who are staying at the retreat. But yeah, we have a very kind of strong topography, I would say, without giving too much away, which yeah, provides a challenge for Ellen and also links to sort of a past case. So we sort of delve a little bit more into Ellen's psyche, and I think we're sort of unpeeling her layer by layer. There's more to Ellen than what we saw. I think I had a few people kind of saying they very much found her to be an unreliable narrator. And it wasn't, I didn't explicitly kind of do that, but I think within Ellen's character, she isn't telling us everything. And I think we learn a little bit more about that in the next book.
Thank you. Now, Silvia, how about after Velvet Was the Night? Can you talk about what you're working on post Velvet?
Yes, well, Velvet will come out in August, so that is the immediate next for me. But I am working on corrections for my next novel this month, and that would be, I'm taping this in July. Should I say that? I don't know. But yeah, no, that is called The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, and that's a historical novel set in 19th century Mexico, in Yucatan, in the south of Mexico. We don't have a release date, sometime in 2022.
That's very exciting. Just from the title, I don't want to push too much on it because, again, you don't know, whether you should be talking about it or not. But you heard it here first, everyone. The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. I'm going to ask a few more questions. I know we don't have all the time in the world, but I think another thing people want to know about is the research that you each did for Mexican Gothic and the Sanatorium. So Silvia, for for Mexican Gothic, you have a lot taking place in this abandoned silver mining town. Mexico City, I imagine, I won't say that was easy to research because, you can't go back to the 1950s. We don't have a time machine yet. But was it more challenging to look at the mining town, or was it more challenging to figure out Noemi's world? A comment on that would be great.
Yeah, it's based on a real mining town that is called Real del Monte or Mineral del Monte, and it's in Hidalgo. I've been there, so I've physically seen what it looks like. It is in the mountains. It is kind of cold and chilly, and it was, in fact, an English mining town in the middle of Mexico at one point in time. I do a lot of research, but it's quite variable. I'm not sure how to explain it most of the time. For example, for the architecture of the house, it's not one single house, it's a composite of several houses. But there was one house in Mexico City specifically that I was looking at that was around the early 1900s, late 1800s, that was built by an Irishman, I believe, and that had this kind of architecture that I found very interesting. Somebody told me that it looked like the Addams Family house, and it is true. After I looked at it, it has that certain kind of look. So if you picture the Addams Family house, that's the look of that house in the middle of Mexico City. And so nothing else looks like it, even in that time period, kind of around it, but there's this just house in the middle of that. And there's other houses that I looked at that were like that. There was a German style house also in Mexico City that again looks like an alpine kind of retreat that existed time. Obviously, it was a German magnate, that kind of stuff. So the houses in Real del Monte have a very specific kind of roof, that tiled roof that doesn't quite look like the local stuff because, again, it was a British town. There were a lot of people from Cornwall. And so that kind of stuff is some things that I look at, interiors, fabrics, what people would have been using in a turn of the century house. And then the 1950s is a different era, of course. So that is more like what somebody of a certain social class might have worn, behaved like, and thought. So Noemi is a socialite.
Yeah.
That obviously implies a certain amount of wealth and resources that other characters might not have. So she's very aloof. She is a modern girl for the time period, for 1950. And so women don't have the right to vote in Mexico yet in 1950. They won't be granted the right to vote until a couple years later. But she's definitely a representative of this type of like modern womanhood. She smokes and, drives a convertible and wears really fancy dresses. If you look at the press of the time and how people are reacting to womanhood and things like that, there are some people who are very critical of that. And they want, they're like, why are our daughters now going out dancing instead of getting married and having children? So there's some of that also embedded in the narrative.
And I want to ask you, Sarah, about this as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of other bigger ideas. So I know, Sarah, that you lived in Crans-Montana in the Swiss Alps when you were in your 20s, and that's where you've set the sanatorium. So in a way, you had a lot of research, quote unquote, done, but that doesn't mean that you didn't need to, let's say, take another trip back. How did it go for you?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think very much the landscape. I live by the coast, so going and living in kind of alpine region was, a hugely different experience for me. And I think probably from the get-go, I always knew I kind of wanted to set some work there, and I kind of had worked on several pieces of short fiction. But very much the landscape was embedded, and I knew I wanted to sort of bring that in. But it was actually only when we were visiting as a family that I kind of stumbled upon the idea of the sanatorium. And it was very much a kind of local magazine had an article about the history of sanatoria on the town, and it was something I wasn't aware of. Essentially, sanatoria opened up the very sort of modern idea of the alpine town as we knew it for Crans-Montana. So the idea of the clinic, essentially there was only a kind of very much a dirt track that people would come up by horse or donkey, and it was really only the sanatoria buildings that kind of opened up the town to what would become kind of modern day winter tourism. So I read that kind of article, and it really sort of sparked that initial idea. And then one of the lines within the text, they called Dr. Theodore Stefani, who sort of set up the initial sanatoria, had described it as the architecture of sublime isolation. And that really kind of, that really appealed to me. And I went down very much a sort of physical rabbit hole in terms of driving around the town and seeing these buildings. A few of them are still clinics. So the sort of rough idea of the architecture I based on a building which is a respiratory clinic today, which is fascinating to kind of drive around. I didn't go inside, but I've sort of found through a local photo historian a lot of images. Yes, amazing images of children. They very much believed the UV rays were healing even in winter. So you had images of children outside just in their underwear, kind of taking in the rays, people wrapped up outside. Yeah, just fascinating. And one of the doctors, Dr. Safani, who opened up, actually kept a huge archive of materials, and a local photo historian has actually published that within a book. So I had a wealth of material of the kind of past of the sanatorium. And yeah, then in terms of the sort of police aspect, which very much played upon my mind, because obviously I took liberties with that, with Ellen being on her own, but I kind of very much wanted to base that on fact. I went and met with a local Swiss policeman who I spent 4 or 5 hours with, and then lots of email to and fro about what would happen in that scenario. So that kind of, yeah, I learned a little bit more. They're very, very strict on procedure in Switzerland, which presented me with a few challenges while I was writing. And then, yeah, there was another book, actually, when I came up, without giving away too much if people haven't read the book, but one of the aspects in the book I bring up is the idea of these sanatoria, which were used for women that were kind of what they would describe as sort of hysterical or ill in their nerves at the time. And I found some fascinating actual documents and letters within a book, which is kind of a bit of a critique of the modern day psychotherapy and Freud. And I found some amazing original letters written from a Swiss sanatorium from one of the women who was basically duped into staying there. Her father kind of said, "You're going on a holiday." They arrived at the train station, were met by a doctor. This is something that happened not just in the Alps, but kind of in the UK as well, as we know. But yeah, it was interesting to get that kind of perspective from a Swiss point of view, from a Swiss woman. So yeah, there was lots and lots of research. I did about 6 months of research while initially starting to write, which felt like, yeah, a real treat. As with the second book, haven't had quite as long.
Hopefully you'll get a little bit more time. I want to ask, I hope that I might have time for one more question after this, but the theme of this year's National Book Festival is open a book, open the world. And so I want to ask each of you either what that means to you personally, or how that might be addressed in your work, however you want to speak about that. So open a book, open the world. Silvia?
Yeah, I think there's many places that I've met for the very first time through a book, and not just places, but time periods and situations that I might not have known about that I read. And that was the way I began to understand the world. So it's a passport into a lot of different realities, both imaginary and real. And it's a fun way, I think, to go on vacation without leaving your living room.
Excellent. Sarah? Yeah, I think very much echoed in terms of a sense of place, but also I think in terms of people. I think I personally think seeing my daughter develop and start to read, where we learn a lot of our empathy and kind of understanding of other people is through narrative, and being inside someone else's head. And I think that kind of fictional world and how we see characters express their thoughts and feelings, that for me is opening up the world. I think you learn to see how other people think, how other people feel, how other people experience things. So yeah, I think for me it's very much place and person.
Thank you both so much. I want to thank the National Book Festival for planning and organizing and sponsoring this panel with Silvia Garcia Moreno, Mexican Gothic, and Velvet Was the Night, and with Sarah Pearse, author of The Sanatorium. Thank you both. Thank you both for being here, and I hope to see you again.
We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and now we'd like you to hear more from the library's own experts on this topic.
Welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Suzanne Schadl, and I'm privileged to serve as acting chief of the Latin American, Caribbean, and European Division. I work with a wonderful team of librarians and editors who work in community with researchers, writers, and artists to foster discovery, collaboration, and access to knowledge and creativity from and about the Caribbean, Europe, Latin America, and related heritage populations elsewhere, including Canada and the United States. I'm excited to share a couple of items from the general and international collection in anticipation of Silvia Moreno-Garcia's latest, Velvet Was the Night, a historical noir novel set in Mexico City during the 1970s. When I see noir and Mexico together, I think of film. The Mexican director Roberto Galvadon, a native of Juarez. He worked as an extra in California before establishing himself securely within Mexico's golden age of cinema as a master of urban melodrama infused with Mexican noir. His film, Marcario, was the first Mexican film to be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. It draws inspiration from a story of the same name by the mysterious B. Traven, who wrote in German, typically about Mexico, where he lived. Traven's work spoke to Galvadon and others in the film industry. This book, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, delves into human greed and corruption against the backdrop of a Mexican landscape and its colonial history, so you can see the noir connection. Some of you may also link this book with a Western of the same name, starring Humphrey Bogart. Writers and filmmakers share their crafts and experiences with one another. Together they cross borders, genres, and eras. It is an exciting journey to follow. I cannot wait to meet the characters of Velvet Was the Night and follow their paths in this historical noir novel. My second item is also visual, and it engages with noir and a different dirty war, blending visual storytelling with investigative journalism. Vida la Vida, Los Sueños en Ciudad Juárez by Edmond Baudin and Jean-Marc Turbeau engages in a written, spoken, and visual conversation around the physical, social, and political landscape of Juárez, telling some of the stories this city holds. In his introduction to this graphic novel, Paco Ignacio Taibo II, who recently edited a wonderful collection of short stories called Mexico City Noir, writes, "Here in Ciudad Juárez, Villismo and its epic were invented. It was the city of the absurd and terrible femicide, still unsolved, incomprehensible and barbarous, terrifying." This page is particularly interesting for its reference to many names, pairs of eyes, and many perspectives, say nothing of different forms of media. I invite you to explore this item and others at the Library of Congress. You're always welcome in the Hispanic and European reading rooms. If you prefer to visit electronically, head to blogs.loc.gov, International Collections. Thank you.